Hi, my name is Scott. I've been painting miniatures for over 2 decades, and today I'm joined by Jimmy.
Hi, guys.
In my career, I've painted a lot of faces. It's actually my favorite part of the model to paint, but for Jimmy, that's less true. What did you actually say they ended up looking like?
Burn victims.
Today, in this video, I'm gonna sit down with Jimmy and we're gonna paint a face from start to finish. I wanna tell him everything he's doing wrong, how I paint a face, so he can go from 3rd-degree burns to first place at a competition. First things first, we need a good grip on the miniature's head, and we'll do that with pinning. With an X-Acto blade, we'll drill a pilot hole. With a pilot hole drilled, let's drill out a bigger hole with a pin vise and an appropriately sized drill bit. It doesn't matter if the hole is centered, preferably it would be on the flattest part of the underside and also allow the model's face to be nice and upright when it's all said and done, as opposed to leaning backward or leaning forward. To approximate the right size, hold up the back of the drill bit to your pinning material, which in my case is just a paper clip that I cut to length. Time to put it all together. I stab the pin into a piece of cork close to the edge. Heads are small, and I want this to not be challenging to reach with a brush. Then, with just a touch of super glue to keep it from rotating, I insert the pin into the hole and we're ready to go. We'll later remove this pin to simply glue the head in place. It's a bit too challenging to make the pinholes line up on the head and body, especially on newer Warhammer figures. And now we're ready to paint. We'll be painting from a black undercoated model because I imagine a lot of you are starting from there, but when dealing with a lot of skin tone on a model, I suggest a lighter undercoat with gray or white just to make it easier to base coat in the beginning. Black will work, it just takes a few more coats of paint, and because of that, you may get some unwanted texture if you're not careful. With the prep complete, we can begin our first base coat. In today's video, we're painting a House Orlock Ganger, and he has a bunch of really decently sculpted volumes on it. So that'll make our job just a lot easier. We're gonna start with a base coat, and today we're using Army Painter Fanatic paints, and I just chose those paints because they're really easy to get. And also the newest range is pretty solid, like they work really well. And we'll start with a color called Fur Brown, which is a darker, kind of warm color. And I think that starting from a dark place, not only a dark place is a good idea, but a dark, warm place is really good to get a lot of liveliness in our skin tone at the end. We're gonna thin this such that it flows off the brush nicely, but we don't lose a lot of opacity. I basically just don't want to fight the paint coming off my brush. I want it to be pretty effortless.
I noticed you put a pretty big dot down. Are you gonna be mixing other colors into this dot as you go through the process?
Yeah, so when I thin my paint, what I do is I thin a zone of it. So like this part is gonna be what I'm using for base coating, in this case, a face. And then I have this full thick stuff that I can use later on for mixing into other paints or for maybe grabbing a bit more and thinning it a little bit more. But this thick stuff will last longer on my wet palette than this thin stuff. If I thin it all out, it spreads out a lot, it increases the surface area, and it dries faster. Some base coating advice. You need to just not mess with the paint after a certain amount of time. Call it 15 seconds, call it 20 seconds. It's really gonna depend on your environment. If you're in Arizona or if you're from Texas like Jimmy is, the paint's gonna dry faster than in Minnesota. Another thing to think about when base coating is, if possible, you don't wanna drag your brush perpendicular across details. So for instance, on his brow, I would paint like this instead of like this, because the paint is not gonna get trapped right above his eyebrow. Sometimes it's impossible, but if you can avoid that, paint with the detail.
If you don't feel like you've got great coverage in one area, but you've already been on it for a couple of seconds, is it better just to leave it alone and then come back to it after it dries?
Yes, absolutely. There is like a desire to want to fix that problem immediately.
Yeah.
Don't give in. Just let it dry, let it be ugly, and then you'll do another layer, another 2 layers, and that problem will go away completely.
So looking at where we are right now,
yeah,
it looks like your first coat was a bit thinner than mine. Like, am I overdoing it in terms of the thickness of that first coat?
Let's check it out. Knowing how much to thin your paint is definitely a skill. And I think maybe just for me, it's like easier to err on the side of thinner rather than thicker. But like, it's a game of chicken, right?
Yeah.
If you can do it thicker and you can go faster and you can waste less time, that's good. Just looking at yours right now, I don't see any obvious errors. Okay. So I would say you did a better job at base coating than I did.
All right.
So, starting out good. But yeah, we'll just keep base coating until we get a nice, solid base coat. It's also worth mentioning that we are using wet palettes today. I'm not gonna really go over it in this video, but I have another video where I discuss how to set up a wet palette for maximum success, because just like any other tool, you can mess it up and it becomes more of a hindrance than it does an aid. Let's take a break to thank the sponsor of this portion of today's video. Judo Grid is a brand new modular display system for your hobby needs and more. Live on Kickstarter right now, this modular system can be adapted to store and display all types of different collectibles. The case size itself is modular and can be expanded and shrunk depending on what's going on inside. Speaking of, the Judo Grid system allows you to mount accessories within the case to completely customize. The team has made a ton of accessories already to display a wide variety of goodies inside your case, such as shelves and tiered displays for miniatures, brush and paint pot holders, card holders, coin holders, and more. Judo Grid is also taking backer suggestions for what accessories they should create during the course of the campaign, so go share your opinion if you think something's missing. The case can rest on top of a surface or be wall mounted. The case you're seeing in today's video is a 3D printed prototype that the team was able to send me. The final version will be made from high quality injection molded ABS plastic parts that look great and last a lifetime. Oh, and did I mention it has lights? My plan for RGB domination is still on the table, baby. The lights can be adjusted to a more neutral color, be on a static color like red or green, or RGB parade mode where they will animate through all the colors. This display case system also comes in a wide range of different colors, and the team over at Judo Grid is also working on an online configurator so you can customize directly on their site. Along with this, they have a planned future alternate reality viewer so you can see its exact size displayed up on your wall in your home. You can find the campaign linked in the description below. Thank you to Judo Grid for sponsoring this portion of today's episode. Now, back to the video. I would say right now, you were kind of just doing a little stabbing motion to get paint deep in the eyes and the mouth and stuff like that. Be careful when doing that you're not like depositing so much paint in those areas where you're really losing it. It's important to kind of like stab in there, but it's also kind of important to kind of then like try to wipe the paint out of that area as well. While it's still wet, you want to coat the inner wall of the mouth. You don't want to put a pool of paint in the mouth, you know?
So like on the forehead here, I can already see like a tiny bit of texture, and my instinct was to start trying to paint over it.
Don't let it go.
Fight it and just leave it alone.
The other thing that may happen is as acrylic paint dries, it contracts. And so you may see texture that ends up disappearing after it dries because it kind of like sucks up a little bit. So definitely let it dry, don't touch it. Okay, so now we're gonna start highlighting. And I like to really kind of work up more slowly. We could just jump right into a color like Barbarian Flesh if we wanted to, but I have a sneaking suspicion that that's gonna be too much of a jump to be easy to incorporate. So I think having one intermediate step in between them is a good idea. What I'm looking for is not necessarily a one-to-one mixture, but a halfway point in between this color and this color. Right now, this still looks a little too dark to me, even though it was literally a one-to-one mixture. I want a halfway point that's like halfway of the brightness in between these two colors, which there isn't really a way to do that. You're just gonna have to eyeball it, but I think that is about right. Some other things to kind of think about is, this model's got like, obvious sculpted details on its eyebrows, around its lips and stuff like that. And the desire is to want to, when you begin highlighting, making sure all of those lines have this dark color still in them. For your first layer of highlight, I would say, especially on the forehead, don't even worry about keeping those little recesses dark. Just base coat over them, straight up. On the lower details, around like the lips and the chin, and like maybe even some of the smile lines, you wanna start keeping some of those things around, but really you're covering up, I would say 90 to 95% of your previous base coat with this paint.
When you change to the first highlighting, do you change the size of the brush? Do you go to a smaller brush at this point, or do you really just kind of stick to the same brush throughout most of the process until you get to the eyes?
I will use this brush for the entire process.
Okay.
But you can do whatever is comfortable for you. I find that with a larger brush, there is a larger capacity for holding paint, and because of that, it dries out less quickly, which is especially important later on when we get to painting the eyes. But if you don't have a large enough brush that has a sharp enough tip, that may not be an option for you. And so you may just need to get a smaller one. I'm gonna mix a little bit of water into this next layer. That's gonna give me some more translucency. It's gonna give me some more flow. It's gonna just, in general, make the painting easier. It's gonna cause less texture, everything. I'm gonna target this lip here. I'm gonna try to keep some shadow under his nose. I'm gonna paint his chin right here. Try to keep some shadow next to his goatee, and also some shadow in between where his lip ends and where it begins.
So one thing I always struggle with is the nostrils, like sides of the nose. Trying to catch those without touching the eye or touching the cheek is sometimes kind of difficult. Is there a trick for maybe the angle you hold the model at, or?
Yeah, there is a bit of a trick. When I paint those things, because they're a spherical volume, I actually paint them with a blob of paint on my brush. So kind of like this. So I have a decent amount of paint on my brush right now, more than I would normally paint with. And I just come in and I touch that one side, and I'll come in and I'll touch the other side. And what's nice about having that blob of paint is that it's like fully opaque, and a blob is a sphere, nostrils are a sphere, and so they kind of like match up nicely. Yeah. And so I don't gotta do a lot of brush strokes, just like one touch, done. And I'll do that on models that don't even have sculpted nostrils, because that is a recognizable face feature that should be on a sculpt. And that's one very small way in which our painting can make the sculpt of a model better.
So oftentimes when I'm trying to paint a specific detail, like say a lip, I'll accidentally just smash the brush into the guy's mouth. And then I end up with a highlight color in a recess that I don't want a highlight color. What's the best way to avoid that, or what do you do when that inevitably happens?
I'd say at this point in the paint job, just let it be, because you'll be surprised later on like how maybe not important of a shadow that was. He has like a pretty recessed cheek, and with this highlight color, I'm painting all the way in that cheek. You kind of have to really adjust how you paint when you kind of leave behind the GW method of starting from the midtone, right? We're not starting from the midtone. We are starting from the color that the wash makes when it dries in the deepest part of the model, right? And that color is like almost exclusively only in the recesses. So cover up a lot of stuff, you know?
Let me look at where you're at versus where I'm at.
So it's subtle. We haven't gone anywhere really fast, but there are small outlines around the goatee and like the lip area.
I can see the sort of wrinkle laugh lines under the nose there and around the goatee. Some of that is just really, really excellent, like brush control that I may not have. If you look at mine versus yours, the lines are so well defined. Maybe I'm not going up enough.
We're at a very subtle stage right now. It's gonna be really hard to notice. But also, acrylic paint is very translucent. So it's possible you just thinned yours more than mine, and you just need to do another layer of highlights. So let's do a second layer of highlights just to see what happens, and literally paint the exact same thing you just did again. You wanna be aggressive with how much area you're covering up, because we got future highlights to fit inside of the work we're doing right now. If you're not aggressive at this stage with how much of the face you're covering up, the future layers are going to be impossible to do because there's just no space to work. In anticipation of doing this video, I reached out to my community to ask them if they had any questions about how to paint faces, and they gave me a lot of great questions. If you wanna make sure that you never miss these type of opportunities, make sure to follow the channel and turn the notifications on. You'll get notifications when I make a post to my YouTube community. Comrade Zij Tomal asks, what's easier, painting from dark to light or paint a light face and then wash and highlight? It kind of is a matter of preference. I've found over the years that I have a greater degree of control when I start from a dark base coat, my darkest shadow, and then work up with a highlight. But it does take some practice. If you've painted your entire life where you base coat something, wash it, and then fix it, what's gonna happen is you're not gonna be aggressive enough with your highlights and how much of the face you should be covering up. Ciro Taro asks, how do you know when the paint is thin enough? I mean for too thin coats. I'm never sure what is too thin or too thick. This is something you're gonna learn with time, but basically what you wanna see on the model is that the paint is settling. Like when you put a blob of paint on the model, it doesn't just sit there as a blob of paint. The edges actually smooth out onto the surface of the model. And also, you're not fighting the paint to come off your brush at all. If it's too easy to come off, say you touch the model and it like floods into the details of the model, That's too thin. But it's somewhere in that middle point. And there's a range band of usable dilutions. It's not like one exact value is correct, but those are the behaviors you're looking for.
What about ears? Any particular things you intentionally avoid or careful to make sure that you hit when you're painting the ear?
I want to hit the upper part of the ear with a nice highlight. I want to make sure there's a nice dark line in between the ear and the temple or side of the head. If it has a lobe at the bottom, this guy seems to have an ear lobe at the bottom. I want to make sure that gets a highlight. And also GW models often have like a little bump just in the middle of the ear. I want to make that have a little highlight as well. And so basically you're going to get a dot, a ring, and then like a lobe at the bottom.
I'm really spending a ton of time trying to get this laugh line thing right. I think this is the classic mistake that I make here.
Yeah, so I think Jimmy right now is trying way too hard to make sure that some of those recesses have shadow in them. Let's just move on a little further just to see if it's going to end up mattering.
Put the brush down.
I'm gonna jump immediately to using pure barbarian flesh. I don't wanna like resort to feathering. I'm gonna pivot right now. I'm just gonna mix a little bit of a brighter layer and use that instead of barbarian flesh. You can get away with fancy blending methods to circumvent using a ton of layers, but I don't wanna do that today. And so I'm just gonna mix up another brighter layer, another step up into barbaric flesh. So now I care about the forehead. Now some of those wrinkles and eyebrows are gonna have shadow in them. And I'm gonna cover up like 70% of the last layer. Because this paint is lighter, it's going to naturally have less opacity going over this like base coat that we have. And so it is going to be almost a requirement that we paint at least 2 layers of this. You're not gonna nail it in one. All right, I want to talk about something with brows that I see all the time, and I've painted it in such a way that demonstrates what I don't like people doing. There can be an inclination to want to keep a thin line starting at the top of his eyebrow, swooping down all the way into the middle of his face, swooping all the way up into the other brow, a line in between that brow. But it's so distracting when you have that recessed shade like that. And so what I like to do is like clip it at the highest points. So I'm gonna connect the highlight to the forehead right here and right here. And there's gonna be a U-shaped recess that exists in between those 2 points, but it's not gonna outline the entire brow. Now is when I'm gonna start leaving behind some of that color also in the cheek. I'm not gonna paint all the way up into that cheek. I'm just gonna grab like the chin. So let's say something like this happens when you're painting like a bald head or the side of a shaved head like we are right now with this Orlock guy. I kind of maybe covered up too much of my previous layer with this layer that I'm on right now. If I want to backpedal a little bit, a great way to backpedal is just to grab a more diluted version of your previous layer. Say like dilute it twice as much as you've been, and just kind of paint the divide in between where the shadow is currently and like kind of where you want it to be. That will kind of soften that transition, bring back some more of that shadow. And it doesn't matter if you can see the layer line. You know, at tabletop height, it's gonna look wonderful. You don't need to bother doing that on like the smaller volumes of the face. There often is not enough room to work to get like a reasonable transition on those parts of the face.
One thing I'm really struggling with in particular that you've done really well is this little outline of the mouth. You know, I'm having a really hard time getting my brush in there without like smushing it into the other parts of the face.
There's so many tools to like deal with different problems, but on this guy, his lips are so well defined that it's almost like an edge highlight. So what I do is the actual point of my brush is like kind of in his mouth, and I'm painting the lip with the side of my brush.
Okay.
Like you would with an edge highlight on a nice protruding edge. I'm not painting it with the very end of the brush. The labored breathing says it all. Sometimes I like forget to breathe and I'm like more focused on like what I'm doing than like making sure I'm not dying.
That's how you can tell you're doing it right, if you're just not breathing at all.
I invite you to my office to do a coaching and you pass out because you're not breathing enough. Ovan2190 asks, what's the best way to set expectations? Because it's never gonna look how you want the first time, but it's hard to rationalize that sometimes. Maybe this will help. In the title of this video, I say something to the effect of the face being one of the hardest parts of the model to paint. That is not clickbait. That is true. It's so true because we as humans know what faces look like. And because of that, it's so easy to tell when something is off. For that exact same reason, painting faces is super challenging because when you don't nail the appropriate volumes, it starts to fall apart. With each little thing you miss, it becomes less and less human and more obviously not painted correctly. And it's difficult because you as a person know what a human looks like, you just don't necessarily know all those important key components. So it's important just to remember that. It's a very difficult thing to paint a face. It's a very difficult thing to paint a face that is smaller than a pinky thumbnail. So just allow yourself to mess up. You're gonna paint this in this way, and it's gonna suck, I promise you. It's not gonna look good. But if you are persistent with it and you keep kind of driving home this process, it will unlock borders for you. It will unlock flexibility. You'll be able to pick shadow colors and highlight colors that are more interesting and not be locked to whatever a wash provides for you. Furthermore, you'll be able to more accurately highlight and shade volumes without having to rely on just how the physics of a wash work.
I think it's also helpful if you really want to be happy with the outcome, to paint next to someone who is not as good at you as painting, so that you always feel like your model looks better than it does.
Okay, yeah. That's a tip from Jimmy.
I'm just like making it worse by trying to fix it. Like I felt like I was so much happier with it 10 minutes ago than I am now.
You tried to tackle this volume in the middle of the face with a very dark shadow color. I think whenever you're gonna do something like that, try to use something maybe a little bit lighter, but also a little bit more diluted. So if you do make a mistake, you're not causing a huge thing for you to fix. But that's not a problem. Mistakes are normal. So we'll just kind of paint over that forehead area, kind of get it back to baseline. You want a little bit of shadow like right there in the middle of the face. I'm gonna grab this color and I'm gonna just drop it down
Just above where the eyebrow sort of falls.
Yeah, and you can also err on the side of just being closer. You could just paint over that brow, because that little line right there is easy to re-highlight. And then now that we have a little bit of shadow there, we will repaint the forehead with a brighter color, leaving some of that shadow there. Again, I like to cover up the areas right here and right here. Okay, so the next step is gonna be painting the eyes. And the reason why I like to paint the eyes at this stage is because we haven't invested a ton of time in the skin just yet. And so if there's some kind of catastrophic failure that occurs, it doesn't really matter because we haven't invested that much time yet. Painting eyes is very difficult, but with these listed tips, you should see some more success. Tip number 1, you don't want that much paint on your brush. A blob of paint, even a tiny one, is less accurate than as small as our brush can be. Tip number 2, you want the paint to flow off of your brush effortlessly. A 1-to-1 mixture of paint to an ink that matches that paint can be a good combination of opacity, but also flow. Tip number 3, you might consider putting some retarder in the paint to slow drying. Because there's so little paint on the tip of the brush, when painting small details, it tends to dry really fast. Sometimes you take too much time to start painting the eye itself and your paint will be dry. The more comfortable you get with painting small eyes, the less you have to rely on retarder. Tip number 4, a sharp tip on your brush is essential. What I will do is rotate and drag the tip of my brush on my hand or a similar non-absorbing surface. This removes the excess paint and creates a tip. I will then press the tip of the brush into my hand so that in one orientation, the brush tip is razor sharp. I will paint with that brush rotated such that I take advantage of that sharp side. Tip number 5, points of contact. Rest your elbows on armchairs, lean your forearms into the table edge, clasp your hands together in the middle, etc. The more points of contact, the better. The absolute best stability points are with your fingertips, however, as that's the closest to where the action is happening. Rest your fingers on the model itself if need be. I do that all the time. I often use nitrile finger cots on the worst offending fingers to protect against unwanted damage to the paint job. Tip number 6, don't breathe. You're a sniper. Just hold your breath for long enough to not interfere with that tiny detail you have to paint. Tip number 7, rarely do I ever break out small brushes, but for painting eyes, I make an exception. But it's not super tiny. A size 0 from Raphael or Da Vinci is just right for me. Obviously, these tips can be applied to any and all miniature painting that we do, but often not all of them are required for the degree of control necessary for painting eyes. So you can kind of use these as you see fit. Step 1 of painting eyes for me is to define where the eyeballs are with my paint. So I put in your palette some dark brown paint called Oak Brown. We're gonna sink some paint into his sockets to kind of understand where the eyes begin and end. This will help us to make sure they're both kind of relatively in the same spot symmetrically, but also they're the same size of oval, they're the same angle and everything before ever putting white down or anything. I wanna know where the boundary is that I get to work in. You wanna cover up as much of the part of the model that you think is an eyeball as humanly possible. Because if you're conservative right now, it just makes every step in the future hard, even harder. So yeah, you may end up painting a part of the model that's not even its eye, but if it looks right, don't touch it.
So I notice you're not diluting that paint at all right now.
I don't wanna,
All right.
I don't wanna mess around with a half opaque thing. I want to like get full opacity right away. So now we understand where the eyeballs can exist, and now we want to use eye white color. So we're gonna take opaque white, just matte white, and the goal is we want a nice thin brown line around the eyeball. That'll make it obvious from a tabletop where the beginning and end of the eye is. You're going to paint the eye like this. You're gonna hold your brush like this. You're not gonna paint like that. That would end in misery, right? Again, the bigger you can make this part of the eye, the better. The thinner that line, the better, because you just give more space for the very last part, which is painting that pupil. Grandpa Jerry asks, is it acceptable to leave the eyes white/blank? I feel like it looks better in some cases, but I'm not sure how others feel. You know what? Miniature painting is a hobby that you get to make for yourself. If you don't want to paint eyes and you think it looks better that way, don't paint eyes. I would say if you're wanting to grow and improve and you want to try out a new technique that's going to be challenging, go for it. Like, I think a well-executed face with painted eyes is always going to look better than an unpainted face. But it's very possible that you're going to make it look worse in your couple attempts. But the more you practice, the better you'll get. And when you kind of get over that hump eventually, you'll paint faces that just look net better just because you have painted eyes. But if you don't want to do that, don't do it. I can tell both of us were a little bit too aggressive, and some of this paint is ending up on that little sculpted lower eyelid. I think I got it with his left eye, which is why it actually looks a little bit smaller than this one. I went a little bit too aggressive on that one. But this one I actually was able to sneak the paint into the actual eye and leave some brown paint before the eyelid starts. But before we paint the eyelid, we have to do the very next step, which is painting the little dot in the middle. Here's another great piece of advice for trying to paint eyes. So what you can do is you can come in with some fresh paint, just do a little marking dot. Okay, now I know that's where I'm gonna be. Now I'm just gonna keep hitting that area again and again and again and again and again, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the tiniest fraction of increased pressure makes that thing get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So I got some pure black. Again, that's just for like maximum contrast, being able to see the eye from a tabletop perspective. And I'm gonna try to nail the center of the eyeball. Remember, when you have a resting face, part of your iris is blocked by your upper eyelid. So you shouldn't just see a little black dot. These guys aren't like on coke. Maybe they are, because Necromunda. But to get a more human, relaxed look, you want a partially covered eyelid, so make it a bit bigger. So sometimes you have happy accidents. The lower eyelid is blocking some of the iris, but not the upper one. And I'm just gonna let that lie. I'm not gonna try to fix it. I'm just gonna try to replicate that with the second one now. Okay, so I messed up. I know I messed up because there's no white on the left side of his eyeball. And so what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna repaint that eyeball. I'm gonna give it another go. Eyeballs are tiny. They take a half a second to base coat. So don't be afraid to just give it another shot, all right? That kind of a crazed expression that matches his kind of crazed look, and I like it. So now at this stage, I would paint the lower eyelids and move on with painting the rest of the face. But, how are you doing?
He's a little bit cockeyed currently, You got to imagine this guy's like seen some things. That's the least of his problems if he's just a little.
Maybe a little too cockeyed, yeah. Yeah, he's got a kind of a Picasso look here, where his eye is leaking onto his cheek a bit.
I was thinking I might fix it when I bring the brown back in to
Oh, try.
recreate the eyelid.
See what happens.
You know?
But who knows? Maybe it's that space Coke, you know?
Oh,
whoa, that
I'm
one
actually
looks
not.
great.
I'm not unhappy with that. To be honest, it's.
If I had eyes that look like this, I love this one. You did great with this one. This one, we got some of that drooping effect, but I like the idea of trying to correct the mistake as opposed to just redoing stuff. And so what we can do to correct it is to start to trim the fat of where paint ended up that it shouldn't be. The one biggest area is just on the side of his nose. And so we'll just start there. So I'll just like kind of lock in this angle where I can see the side of his nose, and I'll just kind of like paint. What do you think? Is that good enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, wonderful. And that's important to note, that everyone gets to decide for themselves what is good enough. Do you want to paint the lower eyelids, or do you kind of feel like the way that this is painted is like, you know, it kind of seems like he doesn't have any anymore?
Part of me could probably endlessly try to correct that little issue back and forth, but I think the odds of me making it worse are slightly greater than the odds of me making it better.
Now that we're kind of happy with the eyes, we're just gonna start highlighting the face to completion now. And so now with this step, now we will for sure go into using barbaric flesh. And if we were covering up 70% of the last layer, we are now gonna be covering up, say, 40% of this layer. As these colors get brighter, they also get less and less colorful, less and less saturated, because more and more white is getting added into the paint. You want to make sure you're not covering up too much of that beautiful, rich mid-tone that we worked hard to establish. As you move on in these highlighting steps, they should go faster and faster. That is, if you kind of have a handle on what you're doing, because you're just physically covering less and less space. And so there's less stuff to paint, so it should go a little bit faster.
I never thought I would say this, but because I really dread painting faces, I kind of told you I always leave it for the last, and then I feel like it ends up ruining my model. But I'm having so much more fun painting this face, and like I can't wait to paint more faces now. Seriously,
yes!
legitimately.
I love that. I also truly love painting faces. It's like, once I kind of got a handle on it, it's the thing that I am most excited to paint. Thomas Gallinari asks, how do you highlight without it turning into zombie skin? You do that in two ways. One, your highlights that get brighter and brighter are very small. You're not gonna cover up a lot of the face with them. Two, the colors you're mixing in to get a highlight color don't have to be pure white. And we're not gonna use that today. When we mix a highlight with Barbarian Flesh, we're gonna use a color called Ice Yellow from Warpaint's Fanatic to get a brighter color. And that's an off-white yellow. And so we're mixing in a color that is brighter, but also has a little bit of saturation in it, a little bit of color. And that's gonna help stem the amount of desaturation that comes from mixing brighter highlights. And now with the face at this stage, we're just gonna keep going, you know? We're gonna take some of this Ice Yellow, we're gonna mix it into our Barbarian Flesh, probably in like a 1-to-2 ratio, so twice as much Barbarian Flesh as there is Ice Yellow. And we're gonna be even more sparing now with our highlights, covering, say, 20% of the previous layer, really hitting those important areas, like the end of the nose, the nostrils, the upper portions of the cheek, his big, fat brows, like maybe the corners of his lips, he's kind of got this screaming look, maybe the very top of his chin, at the top of his ear, you know? Maybe not the lower lobe part, but the top part of the ear. All those areas can get highlight, but be sparing. Don't go crazy with it. You don't need a lot to add a lot of definition to the face. Oh yeah, this is great. I think paint a little bit more of the forehead. You don't want that much shadow sticking around.
All right, so where should I add more to the forehead?
Your little dot of highlight in the middle is just a little bit too big, so it could be smaller, and the shadow should occur around that smaller highlight. But on like the areas closer to the mohawk, like that part should have some nice brighter highlight. Okay, we're gonna do one last layer of highlight. It's gonna be the fastest one because it covers the smallest area. We're gonna do pure Ice Yellow. And I'm not even gonna really do brush strokes in a conventional way. I'm gonna dot, 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 maybe a little bit of stroke on the bottom lip, dot, dot, and just be done. I also do this because paint tends to dim over time, and this might seem like we're going a little too intense, but when you pick this model up tomorrow, it will not seem like it's too intense. It will dim over the course of 24 hours. All right, we've come to the end of painting the faces. Here are our final results side by side. And I'm kind of curious, Jimmy, did you have any like key takeaways from this process?
You know, one of the biggest takeaways for me was that as intimidating as it can be to paint a face with all the individual elements that exist inside the face, if you break it into steps and you do it a piece at a time, it's much more approachable, and mastering sort of one facet before moving on to the next just made it a lot simpler. I also found that not being too fixated on every part being perfect, and recognizing it's okay to go back and fix some things later, and that you kind of have so many steps in between where you can fix some of the things that you were unhappy with. Like the end result, you know, came out better than the sum of the parts. I also, for the first time, I wouldn't have had the confidence to push the highlights as high up to pure ice yellow, but seeing it applied and seeing it work really well just completely kind of changed the way that I view how far you can push a highlight.
Yeah, when you're applying super bright highlights, they don't need to be big. They can be really tiny, and they do all of the heavy lifting that a big layer would do without totally like blowing out your saturation or making things look like pale and kind of ghostly. If you guys have any questions about painting faces, let me know. Put them down in the comments below. I'll make sure that I answer a couple of them. If you have different advice that you apply to painting faces, why don't you try that down there below? I would love for this video to be a resource for beginners on how to paint Caucasian skin tones on faces like for Warhammer miniatures like this. There are all different ways you can paint faces, different ethnicities, different face shapes, different genders, and they all have their own kind of little nuance to them. But this is a great starting point. If you guys appreciated the video and you like the channel, you want to support it, there are a number of ways that you can do that. All things linked down in the description below. One example is you could pick up one of these cutting mats that we both got to use today. They're double-sided, they're about 3 mil thick, they're self-healing, and they're a great surface for measuring stuff, but also just protecting your table as well. Subscribe and die! But most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis!